How different does all of this look?
Looks really different.
There's automated gates that look pretty sturdy with a stop sign on them.
I'm standing outside the gates of the most sensitive intelligence facility in Australia, with two women as they remember some wild times from their 20s. I'm a journalist in Alice Springs and I've driven down most streets here, but this one's always felt off limits.
It's a cops now.
Oh, here comes the Australian Federal Police.
Elsa, my producer, is with me, and the women, now in their 60s, Sue and Jenny.
I'm phoning the ABC. We're reminiscing with two women who were here for the Women's Peace Camp, who camped just along here in 1983.
Within 15 minutes, there are 4 armed police officers and 3 vehicles surrounding us.
I did see the sign said no photography. Is it okay just to do voice recording?
The first officer says he needs to check with his boss. I keep recording so you can hear what we say, but legally, I can't share what they say.
Are they filming us by any chance?
That's Jenny, and yes, we're being filmed. Even though it's a public road, whether we can record is a grey area. We're within sight of Pine Gap. Mind you, we can't actually see anything from here. Yes, the large guard station is a few hundred metres in front of us, but then it's just a road disappearing between 2 hills. The 10-storey high golf ball-like radomes that cover listening antennas are well hidden. Eventually, the head of security arrives. I've never met him, but I've heard about him. He smiles, looks me squarely in the eyes and says, "I know exactly who you are." Sold as a space base to locals in the late 60s and rumoured to be caught up in the demise of an Australian Prime Minister in the 70s, the 80s saw the CIA-run base in Alice Springs become the focus of Cold War nuclear fear. The Americans were using this secret place deep in the Outback to spy on the Soviets and their missiles. Increasingly, peace activists were convinced this made Pine Gap a prime nuclear target. And it was the women who flooded to the desert to try and shut the base down and break its wall of silence. What was really happening at Pine Gap? Why was there so much secrecy that authorities would turn to intimidation and mass arrest to protect it? I'm Alex Barwick, and this is episode 3, The Women Get Wild.
I can remember at some point that women were going to try to get the gate off.
Jenny was in a sea of women at the gates of Pine Gap. She reached out her hands, fingers wrapped around the wire and steel.
We were rocking it back and forth.
Around 800 women had gathered for an anti-nuclear protest. That day, a group of them had decided it was time to go in.
We got it off its hinges and lifted it up, walked along holding on to it and singing like mad, and the musicians were there and it was like a little parade.
Jenny and this group of women carried the gate above their heads.
We just went into the base with it.
They were now trespassing on Commonwealth land. When I spoke to her, it was almost 40 years to the day that Jenny broke into Pine Gap.
And are you recording?
Elsa and I are walking from my house up to Jenny and her partner Sue's place. They live 4 doors up on the other side of the street. They're delightful neighbours. Jenny's an artist. She's got a grey pixie cut and wears sensible shoes. Her partner Sue is a poet and I often see her watering natives on the verge. We've lived on the same street for years, but I had no idea it was the huge women's protest that brought them both to Central Australia. Not surprising, maybe. No one talks about Pine Gap. Back in 1983, Jenny didn't know Sue either, as she set off from Sydney in a convoy of packed buses.
We had all our camping gear, musical instruments, props and paints, and lots of riotous laughter and singing.
Alice Springs today is unofficially the lesbian capital of Outback Australia. What happened at the Pine Gap gates likely helped it get that crown. But 40 years ago, the town was pretty conservative. And as the buses rolled in, residents soon realised these weren't the kind of women they were used to.
We looked a little wild, I think. Or just maybe a bit flamboyant, but also as time went by, we were pretty dusty and bedraggled.
The threat of nuclear war had mobilised women across the country. Known as the Women for Survival Peace Camp, what was happening in little old Alice Springs was actually part of an international Cold War peace movement centred at Greenham Common in Berkshire, England, where tens of thousands of women were camped.
Their supporters, and there are many of them as well, believe the fact that the Greenham protesters are women has provided new arguments for nuclear disarmament.
This base in my backyard gave America an edge over the Soviets. It gathered information about their missiles from satellites eavesdropping overhead. It was crucial for the Americans, making it a crucial target for its enemies. The women who came to Alice Springs didn't want Australia involved in nuclear war. Almost 1,000 women descended on this little town to try and close Pine Gap. Jenny put up her small orange A-frame tent. There were tarpaulins for shade pitched on the hard ground alongside the road into the spy base. It was hot, with no running water, but they came up with ways to keep each other cool.
Do you want a squirt?
We all had these squirty bottles with a couple of drops of lavender oil, and we squirted each other quite generously with those.
Jenny was still working out who she was when the women's camp started on November the 11th, 1983.
I was a baby lesbian, and I was still a baby feminist, really. I had long blonde hair tied up in a ponytail. It was a dawning of consciousness for me. I felt really lucky that I could go. So there was a sense that we were speaking for a lot of women.
But this was the 80s, when way too many people still thought women belonged in the kitchen. One bloke even left the local peace group furious that it was a women's-only protest. Come on. This whole battle of the sexes thing was also on the women's agenda, even over whether they should be allowed to sort out some makeshift toilets.
There was a debate amongst some of the women in the camp as to whether it was okay to let men play this role of carting away the shit. I do remember some of our friends, women in the camp, saying, well, that's perfect job for them.
That shit shoveler is Bob Boughton. Bob had been riding up to Alice Springs from Sydney on his motorbike, crashing at Philip Nitschke's house and learning about Pine Gap.
There was a lot of really quite misogynist, aggressive, homophobic kind of abuse directed at these women.
I'm not being derogatory to women at all, but their sanitary, their cleanliness, they seem to be devoid of really any nice human nature.
That's Bernie Kilgariff. You heard him back in episode 1. He was the Alice Springs politician in the late 60s who fought to make sure the base benefited the town.
Did they ever wash?
He was a man of his time.
I don't know. Well, you'd have to say that by and large, the people of Alice Springs were disgusted because of their behaviour, health-wise and whatever.
Unfazed by the pushback, this groundswell of women had carefully planned every element of the camp and protest.
We were part of a health and well-being tent close to the gate so that we could, intervene if women looked like they were about to get heat stroke or were freaking out.
The camp and the marches at Pine Gap's gates were colourful. Balloons floated high in the air. Women carried huge fabric banners and parasols to shade the hot sun. There were papier-mâché missiles, street theatre, tambourines, guitars, singing, and more singing. The authorities had also boosted their resources in response.
There were helicopters flying up and down during the night with lights. So they were using big searchlights going up and down over the camp, and sort of intimidation.
After a disrupted night's sleep, Jenny got up the next morning and ate a bowl of muesli. She was about to do something she'd never done before.
Got dressed, got our little packs ready.
She grabbed her hat. The sun was already beating down as hundreds of women headed towards the gates of Pine Gap. After ripping the gate off its hinges, the women carried it above their heads into the base, then flung it to the ground.
8 or so of us started running.
Full of adrenaline, Jenny headed inside the fence line towards the base.
I veered off the road and ran through the scrub.
Were you feeling scared?
Adrenalised and probably scared, but I just really wanted to move very fast and go as far into the base itself as I could get.
Her hat blew off. She could hear footsteps closing in.
I had a quick peek and it was a policewoman. She was in navy. I could hear her gaining on me.
Suddenly, Jenny felt a pull on the back of her head.
She grabbed me by the ponytail. She got a good firm grip on my hair. You're under arrest and you have to come back to the bus with me. And then someone else came along and had me by the other arm and they kind of frog marched me back.
It all sounds kind of exciting, and it was, but then it wasn't.
I wasn't really prepared for what it would be like. In the watch house, it felt like it was freezing.
The cells were grey with 2 concrete beds in each.
It was probably a little bit traumatic, probably a bit scared about what the processing would be like.
In the days prior, more than 100 women had been arrested for trespassing on the base, and rumours had circled back to camp that police were pretty rough.
They wanted us to be fingerprinted. They took us one by one. They had lined us up outside this room. And I think I just said something like, you don't have to fingerprint me and I don't want you to. And they were like, we don't want any trouble from you. On the desk there, they had this kind of gripper, like a thumbscrew thing. And they said that you can either be printed or we'll put that on and we'll print you anyway. Some of them were starting to get very aggro. There were a couple of guys in the background and there was this real sense of threat, if you don't cooperate. So I did. But I think the worst thing for me was after that being put in a cell adjacent to where they were doing that, and my friend was next and she did scream and fight and they really hurt her and they broke her thumb.
Jenny's friend was screaming from the pain.
I think after that the women probably didn't fight as much as she did. And then we all ended up in that little cell. It had a high window with bars and we were shouting out and then we could hear voices outside. So we knew that the women from the camp had come and were supporting us outside. So we could hear them singing.
The turnout for the Women's Peace Camp was diverse. Across 2 weeks, local Aranda women, Aboriginal women from across the country, environmentalists, Christians, and a few politicians too, united against nuclear war.
I'm Gary Smith. First of all, I'm a black Australian. And then second, I'm a black woman. This installation is a symbol of global violence.
As for the police brutality, the papers printed claims women were stripped in their cells after a tip-off they'd sewn razor blades into their clothing. None were ever found. Police denied all the allegations, saying they could have laid more charges than they did for damage to property and providing false names, and that protesters were given every opportunity to cooperate. The Human Rights Commission even travelled to Alice to investigate. The Ombudsman's final report says it could find no evidence of widespread brutality. It highlighted there was a small group of rowdy, aggressive protesters pushing the envelope in the watch house. So it dismissed the claims of wrongdoing, saying that the protesters weren't squeaky clean either, even repeatedly blocking the toilets with anything they could. Paper, even a pair of panties. I tracked down a cop who was there in 1983. He told me the claims were nonsense and it would have been impossible for police to break someone's thumb with the tools they were using. Jenny and Sue never met during those 2 weeks. There were so many women, but their worlds had collided. They would fall in love in the years that followed and eventually make Alice Springs home. In fact, it turns out quite a few women from the camp would settle in the Outback. As planned, the bush camp on the fringes of Alice Springs was packed down after a fortnight. There'd been well over 100 women arrested, and the protest had got national coverage. But the spy base, it returned to business as usual.
The women's protest hadn't closed the base or revealed its secrets, but it would inspire waves of people to travel to the heart of the country and to put their bodies on the line in the years to come.
And it had raised the stakes in the nation's capital, Canberra.
So I used to say, when I was looking at those demonstrators at Pine Gap at the time, I said, so you don't want any arms control and you want a nuclear war. Well done. Get stuck in.
Labor politician Kim Beazley had closely watched Gough Whitlam's demise. He had no time for these hippies.
What they're calling for is the blinding of the United States and the blinding of Australia. And you don't tend to be at all sympathetic to that point of view.
What do you think would have been dangerous about the closure of Pine Gap at that point?
The point about the facilities is that they're critical to maintaining a balance which retains the peace. So people who are campaigning against Pine Gap were campaigning to open up the possibility of nuclear war.
While protesters argued Pine Gap made Australia vulnerable to a nuclear strike, the government saw it as protection, and not just for us. It initially sounded contradictory to me. How could Pine Gap be both a nuclear target but also help stop a nuclear war? But I can see how Pine Gap's intelligence might put the brakes on a hostile party launching a missile.
Because that inside information might just mean they get nuked first. As I speak to more people, I'm realising this secret base is complicated. As women tore the front gate off this base shrouded in secrecy, Kim Beazley's political career was taking off. Back in 1980, he'd won a seat in federal parliament. By 83, Labor was returned to power, and in 84, Kim Beazley had become Defence Minister, responsible for the Pine Gap Partnership. Kim, can you describe what kind of a politician you were then?
Very young and overweight. You want a description of me in the 1980s? That's it.
Kim did have something in common with the protesters, though. He wanted to know the secrets of Pine Gap.
We'd come into office on the basis that we needed to have full knowledge of what was going on in the facilities and consent to their activities.
Why, after almost 2 decades since the deal was done between the US and Australia, was our government still in the dark?
We were very conscious that there was a high level of probability that those facilities were targeted by the Russians with nuclear weapons, and that we needed to level with the Australian population about that.
I was struck by this. The former Australian Defence Minister confirming that yes, Pine Gap was a nuclear target, and it might be worth letting the Australian public know. I've trawled through a lot of archival documents from that time. The authorities were consistently playing down any likelihood of a nuclear missile attack.
A top secret study was even done, assessing the fallout if Pine Gap was bombed. It suggested evacuating Alice Springs or at least taping up the kitchen windows. Can you imagine your home becoming a nuclear target, but you aren't even told? That report was only declassified 3 decades later. Anyway, Kim Beazley knew the Soviets had Pine Gap in view.
It was a nuclear target back in the 1980s, but nevertheless it was necessary to host them because they are absolutely critical to the global balance on which peace and stability was based.
And that's still Kim Beazley's argument today, and he's not alone. But as Defence Minister, he wanted to dig deeper.
What I wanted to know was what they are actually doing, not just simply the capability. So how was the capability being used at that point of time?
What did you find out?
Oh, well, as though I'm going to tell you.
Kim Beazley says he got the detail, but the Australian public then, and even now, wouldn't be let in on the secrets.
He began regular trips to Alice Springs, flying in and flying out. You know what else kept flying in and flying out?
Those huge military cargo planes. And crouching in a ditch next to the tarmac in Alice Springs was that guy who'd helpfully shovelled shit at the women's camp, Bob.
It was very hot and dry. It was very scrubby, sort of sandhill country with lychee bushes and mulga bushes around.
Bob and 3 friends wanted to stop an enormous US military plane from landing with their bicycles. It was 1985.
Possibly the craziest political action I've ever undertaken in my life.
Reports from the United States have suggested an upgrading of Pine Gap to meet the tasks associated with a new generation of United States spy satellites.
Bob had caught wind that Pine Gap was expanding, and these huge Galaxy planes were flying in the crucial spy parts.
So we figured that if we could get onto the tarmac, the plane would have to abort its landing.
It's one of the most hair-raising Pine Gap protests I've heard so far.
And we were lying in the bush for at least an hour, waiting. We were just cracking nervous jokes about what might happen to us.
Another group had gathered at the terminal end. They were the decoy.
And I just remember seeing this massive plane and thinking, my God, it really is very large. This big grey-green warplane. And we took off. We grabbed our bikes and we ran through the bush and we got to the tarmac and we jumped on our bikes and started riding. And the plane was coming in towards us. And it was absolutely huge. Like it came over the top of me. It was quite low and quite terrifying.
Bob pedalled hard.
We had no choice. We had to keep going.
The plane roared overhead.
Just as it went over the top, it banked and lifted and it did a big turn. And we realised we'd done it. And we just went berserk. We hooted and hoo-ha. The yellow cars from the airport security came flying out onto the tarmac and started chasing us. The car can't catch a bike because the car pulls up next to you and then you take off again. They go after one of us and then they go after the other, and when they went after one, then another one would take off. We felt like we'd pulled off this extraordinary action.
They had. They'd stopped a Galaxy military plane from landing for about 15 minutes when it did land. Protesters through the 80s genuinely believed they could shut down Pine Gap. Why would they go to such extreme lengths if they didn't? They thought once the country knew how close to home the nuclear threat was, the Australian government would respond. But Australia was in deep with the United States. What chance did papier-mâché missiles, street theatre and bicycle stunts ever have against this growing military alliance? Bicycle Bob copped a fine for putting his body and bike on the tarmac, and the arrests over Pine Gap would keep coming. Momentum was building for something big before the decade was out.
We are gentle, loving people, and we're singing.
Peace activists have launched a national campaign to close the Joint Defence Facility of Pine Gap.
It is our intention to give 12 months' notice of termination of the above agreement.
We were delighted to have Peter Garrett as one of our supporters. He's one of the most popular musicians in the country.
Russell Goldflam, the curly-haired young man who joined the local peace group, wanted Pine Gap to be the focus of a newly formed national anti-bases coalition. Plans built towards a huge conference and action for October 1987. The Cold War fear of nuclear annihilation was causing a groundswell around the country, and Russell was sure their group could persuade people to come to Alice Springs. And they did.
I'm Yudindali, the Trigawana, on my Gummeroy grandfather's side. I'm Ungai, the Paddy Melon Wallaby, on my maternal grandmother's side. And I'm Bigamball, on my great-great-grandmother Susie's side. My given name is Barbara Flick.
Barb grew up on the Darling River in New South Wales. Born in 1951, she comes from a long line of strong women who've called out racism. After moving to Alice Springs in the mid-80s, she was one of almost 1,000 fired up by the nuclear threat of the Cold War. And that saw her running, just like Jenny a few years earlier, across prohibited land, police on her tail.
But I had been in training, so I took off. This policeman, who wasn't very fit and was overweight, was chasing me, and he couldn't catch me. I felt so good about that. I remember running to the nearest little hill, getting up to the top and waving back at the crowd.
But when Barb turned herself in, she realised she was getting a very different experience in the watch house compared to the white protesters.
They took me down to the cell where they kept what they called the drunks. And of course they were all Aboriginal people. I went in to the cell and they locked the door. So I started singing Paper Roses. Deceive me with tender looks that I mistook for love.
The next day, Barb represented herself in the boxy, sandy-coloured law courts in the centre of town.
They asked, well, how do you plead? Well, I need to know what I'm charged with. When you're charged with trespass on Commonwealth lands.
The thing is, Barb had sought permission from the Aranda people to be on that land. Their land.
I said, well, I wasn't trespassing. I was on the land of the Aranda people with their permission.
That permission meant nothing before the courts. She was found guilty of trespass and ordered to do community service. What a decade for the Alice Springs Peace Group.
They'd supported a huge women's protest,
stopped a military aircraft from landing, and encouraged hundreds of people to trespass and get arrested. But they still hadn't closed the base or exposed what was happening inside. And then, after simmering for decades, the Cold War, the conflict that had fueled these protesters, ended, almost in parallel with the 80s ending.
We were trying to think, what does this mean? Does that mean, like, America's won everything and all of a sudden there's no need for Pine Gap?
Russell's beloved peace group began to fizzle.
We ran out of smoke. Momentum that had been building all through the 1980s for the peace movement in Australia had kind of evaporated overnight. The Cold War was finished. So the peace group had run its course.
With the Cold War over, was there even a need for Pine Gap? Well, yep, because there's always another war or conflict on the horizon. Turns out it would only grow.
From the number of radomes that shield listening antenna pointed above the earth, to the scaled-up security checkpoint that stops entry to the base.
Here we are at the fence. This is the very place that divides us.
The fence at Pine Gap is much higher than when Sue and Jenny came to protest with all those women in 1983. The turn-off from the main road gives nothing away about what lies within. But as you approach the checkpoint, a series of signs make it clear you're not welcome.
Commonwealth of Australia Prohibited Area, Defence Special Undertaking Act 1952, no trespassing, no photography, no firearms, maximum penalty, imprisonment 7 years.
The Australian and American flags flap high in the breeze above countless cameras and endless barbed wire.
The stakes are really high around this thing. It's chilling, isn't it, that they feel so much the need to ramp it up like this.
The stakes surrounding Pine Gap have grown since the 1980s.
Now we know it was never just about arms control and giving America the upper hand in the Cold War. With more and more oversized golf ball-shaped radomes appearing on the desert floor, America's listening ears were growing. More communications could be intercepted than ever, and Pine Gap was about to change the way wars are fought.
There's probably very few places on Earth that would look like the Pine Gap operations floor.
And finally, I'm going to hear the story from the inside, from a spy, someone who worked inside Pine Gap for years. I'm Alex Barwick. This is Spies in the Outback, Season 3 of the ABC's Expanse podcast.